Hello and welcome to End of Life University Seminar Series. This is your host, Dr. Karen Wyatt, and I'm so glad that you're tuning in today to join us on this series. And I'm happy each time to find out how many people are tuning in and listening and really finding something to learn and be inspired by through these interviews. So thanks once more for taking time out today to be with us for our conversation. And if you're interested in getting unlimited access to all the interviews, remember you can purchase the Access Pass, which is just $36, and that gets you every interview from the past, even the 2013 interviews, and that you can listen to at any time as often as you want. So today I'm happy to welcome my guest, Sarah Kerr. Sarah is a death midwife and ceremonialist in Calgary, Canada. Using principles of nature-based spirituality, Sarah supports her clients and their families on the journey of illness, death, or loss. With ritual, Sarah helps people connect to the wisdom of their own souls, to their community, and to that which they hold sacred, and to draw support from these larger powers. Meaningful ritual provides medicine for our souls, and Sarah facilitates rituals around endings and death that honor the spiritual significance of the process and bring healing to both the living and the dead. Sarah has a master's degree in environmental philosophy, a master's certificate in intuition medicine, and a PhD in transformative learning. She has also been a longtime student of paganism and cross-cultural shamanism and has studied with many indigenous and Western teachers. Sarah has been a community organizer, a group facilitator and trainer, and a curriculum designer, as well as leading extended wilderness expeditions in Alaska and the Canadian Arctic. She is a visual artist and integrates her painting and mixed media sculptures into her healing work. Sarah works with clients in person and by phone and Skype. So Sarah, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here today for our conversation.
Thanks so much, Karen. It's lovely to be here.
Well, I've spent a lot of time on your website, and you have just a beautiful website, and it's so artistically done. And so I've been very excited to talk to you about just your use of the arts and ritual in your end-of-life healing work with people. But I was hoping you'd just start our conversation, as I asked most of our guests to, just by talking about your own story and how you came to be interested in doing end-of-life work.
Sure. I think there are two branches of my story. One is quite personal and one is more collective. Or philosophical, perhaps. The personal one is that 4 years ago my father had a stroke, and he had been healthy and vigorous, and suddenly he had a massive stroke and is still in long-term care in a wheelchair, really deeply, deeply compromised. Who he was is gone. And when that happened, it was so sudden and so shocking, and I remember so clearly this experience of being just stunned by how hard this was. And on top of that, angry that no one had prepared me that this might happen in my life. I was really lucky. I was 45 at the time, and I'd never had anyone in my life have a major illness or any kind of sudden trauma like that. But, of course, that happens to many, many, many people, and it happens to most of us at some point, by some point along the process. So I was really angry that my culture hadn't taught me how to deal with this, that it happens all the time, and it was such a normal thing to need to know, and I didn't know. And that really shaped my conviction and my commitment to helping people through this process. And as he was in the hospital with stroke, I realized that he's going to die at some point, and I'm going to be equally unprepared for that unless I do something about it. And so that was a big step on my journey of coming face-to-face with death work in anticipation and in advance so that when it happens, we're prepared. Mm-hmm. And the other part is I've been a community activist and a community organizer for many, many years, and I've been working for social justice and ecological causes all my adult life. And I went back to school to do my PhD and sort of stepped out of activism into really thinking about how change happens and going into a deeper, the foundations of it. And when I graduated, I looked around and I thought, well, where is the most healing that's needed in this world? And what's going to have the biggest impact on our health and well-being? And it really strikes me that death and our relationship with death, our cultural denial and fear of death, is the source of a lot of the behaviors that we as a culture do that are causing such devastation to people and to the planet. And that really, we as a community, we need some therapy around death and end-of-life work. And so that's another big reason that pulled me into this, is that it's an opportunity to help individual people, but I also feel it is an important cultural shaper to change how we meet death.
Well, I love hearing that story, and I'm in complete agreement with you. I have the same feeling that much of what is pathological in our culture and our society arises from our inability to confront the reality that we're mortal, the reality that we all die. And so we spend our time running away from that truth and denying it and trying to cover it up and doing anything we can to not have to really see it in our own lives. Yeah. So I totally agree with you. And I love the fact that, you were given a challenge to cope with, which actually led you into the work that you were meant to do.
Yeah, it's a very personal commitment to it.
Yes, and I think that that's been true for so many people. That's one of the reasons that I always ask that question, because I've been fascinated to hear the stories of how people came to see the importance of end-of-life work and how people ended up doing it for themselves. And it's been true for so many of my guests that each one of us has gone through some sort of loss or trauma of our own that really catalyzed this career path. And what that means is that there are a lot of people in end-of-life work who are very passionate about being here and doing what we do, including you, which is wonderful.
Yes, I'm thrilled to be doing this. And I think it's true that you can't take someone somewhere that you haven't gone yourself. And so in all the kind of helping professions, having done our own work is what allows us to support other people.
So true. That's very true. Well, and in fact, we would have no credibility had we not faced these challenges ourselves.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, that's perfect. Well, I'm excited to get into the discussion with you about the importance of rituals, for one thing, in life in general, but particularly at the end of life, because I feel like that's a topic that isn't given much attention, at least in the circles I operate in. So I'm really interested to hear what you have to say.
Well, I am passionate about the power of rituals to help soothe and ease and heal. To my understanding and in my experience, rituals are a kind of energy medicine. Just as any of the listeners who have gone to a Reiki practitioner or had acupuncture or many, many other healing modalities that understand the impact of energy and how to shift energy to bring healing. Rituals shift energy, and they change things. And throughout time and culture, humans have used rituals to process the big transitions in our lives. All the rites of passage, all the phases we go through, from adolescence to adulthood, from singleness to being married, all the different phases, those are marked with rituals. And what rituals do is really, among other things, they help our souls catch up to what's happening on the outside. That, especially around end of life, it's such a big transition, and there are physical changes happening. Someone's getting ill. Someone's dying. There are goodbyes to be said. There are endings. And sometimes our souls need a little bit of help to process and integrate that. That if we don't give some space for that, we end up carrying the unprocessed emotions, and we can carry those for a long, long time, for the rest of our lives. And they become a weight in our system. They're calcified, stuck energy. And that can be really not very helpful to our lives. I think the other thing that's exciting about ritual is that they heal the collective body. In any situation, say in a family, someone dies. The person who's dying has had one experience in that process. Each of the people around him or her has their experience. But we also have a collective body. There's a family soul, and there's a community body. And one-on-one grief therapy and other kinds of end-of-life support can be helpful for individuals, and I have great appreciation for that. But I think it's really beneficial if that can be balanced with some community work, where people come together to process the intensity of what's happened.
I love what you said, that the ritual allows the soul time to catch up, since the language of the soul isn't really linear or rational. The soul responds to art and music and sound, and it makes sense why ritual is what the soul needs in order to process what's taking place. And to just think logically about an event that has happened doesn't provide that adjustment for the soul.
No, not at all. And you're so right that the soul responds to art and music, and that the history of ritual is closely intertwined with the history of theater. Theater was originally a healing modality, and the way that theater and storytelling and the magic that can happen on stage with drama and costume and the ceremonial actions and gestures that can be so beautiful, the way that it transports us, it really takes us out of ourselves into a different state of consciousness. That's where our souls live, is in that beauty and theatrical place. So ritual really speaks there.
Yeah, that's just so beautiful, and that makes sense to me, because I've struggled to explain myself why ritual is important. I have an innate sense that it is. I know that it is, but I haven't had such a clear understanding of why and how it makes a difference to us. But one of my previous guests, who's a chaplain in a hospital, told me she's been very disturbed to find a number of people who don't value the ritual of a funeral at the end of life, and have just said to send their elderly loved ones off to the crematorium, and they would pick up the ashes later, and there would be no memorial service and no funeral. And so I've wondered if you have any thoughts about that.
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts about that. I think that's a really, really important question. And I understand people who are disillusioned with funerals. I think probably not wanting a funeral might come from a couple of different perspectives. One might be just not wanting to get close to the death process and to push it away, and that's one issue. But I think for many people, it's that funerals have become empty and hollow, and they are unsatisfying. And so rather than have something that's unsatisfying or even distressing, sometimes funerals are for whatever reason, they're done in a tradition that is not meaningful to the people who are there, and they don't find healing in it, and they can really be unsuccessful. I think that's one of the reasons that people reject funeral. And funerals are really important. They mark a period. There's a threshold that opens, a gateway that opens when someone dies. And it's the same gateway that opens when someone is born. And for 3 or 4 or 5 days, time stands still, and all the other cares of the world have to be put aside, and we just become present to the truth that someone we love is gone. And funerals use that magic opening to bring healing. Mm-hmm. And if they're done properly, and a funeral is it's a tool, I guess is almost the word. It can be done well, or it can be done not well. It can work, or it cannot work. If they're done well and if they work, they help the living to make the transition from life with the person to life without the person. A huge transition to go through. And they put them on the path of their grief healing. They start people on that journey. And for the dead, in my understanding of the world, a funeral actually serves a very pragmatic purpose also to help the person who's died get to where they need to go. That if there's some survival of some aspect of us after we die, and there's lots of research to demonstrate that, and certainly lots of experiential evidence, then they need our help. And a funeral actually serves them, and if it's done right, they benefit from it too.
That's an interesting point. My mother died last year, and she had planned her funeral. She started planning her funeral 5 years before she died, and she was homebound, and so she spent a lot of time working on this funeral. And we had a whole notebook of notes, and she planned the music and the passages she wanted read from the Bible, and who would read them and who would speak, and who she had every moment of the funeral planned in detail. And my brother and I, we had her notebook, and we were carrying out her plans and trying to contact the people she wanted to speak. And we both looked at each other and we said, she will be there watching if we don't do what she asks. She'll be watching it, so we have to carry this out. And one thought was, it was very comforting to me to know that I was meeting her wishes, and that she was having the funeral that she had envisioned and that she had wanted. But there was a part of me, I will say, that thought, I wish I could have chosen a song myself that would have comforted me. I wish I could have chosen parts of that funeral for me. And then I realized, that's an interesting question, because I always hear people say the funeral is for the survivors. And you're making the good point that the funeral actually helps the dead as well. So anyway, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, but my own sense was I would love to have been able to choose a few parts of the funeral myself to make it the comfort that I was looking for, in addition to what my mom wanted.
Yes, and it's for both. It's for the living and for the dead, and it needs to be a balance that serves both. And so it sounds like it brought your mom a lot of comfort and security and confidence, and probably gave her meaning to be able to organize this and structure it the way. And that has great healing power, and that's a beautiful act for someone to do on their own behalf. And at the same time, the parallel stream in that is a funeral is something we do for other people. And we do for other people. We also do for our own healing. And to be able to choose something that spoke to you, and also to be able to design what you want to do as an offering to your mother. Those are both other important aspects of what a funeral can be. And for every person, there'll be in every family, there'll be the right balance of those things. But sometimes I think people who plan their funeral a long time in advance, and there can be lots of ways of doing this, but one aspect of what's going on might be sort of wanting to look after myself and not burden anybody with my needs. And I'll do it so they don't have to do it for me. And we live in a culture that doesn't really know how to give or to receive very well. Receiving is a big art, and it's a big healing. So all those things factor in, I think, to that question.
That's such a good point. And I know that you do ritual counseling with people, and I'm wondering if do you ever assist people in creating these end of life rituals? Is that part of the work that you do?
Yes, it's a big part of it, both for current deaths. I work with people from some period before the death, when people know a death is coming, until after it. That's one time I work with people. I also do quite a lot of work with people healing unresolved deaths from the past. And this is more of the distance work that I do. Because when someone dies, sometimes the proper rituals aren't done, and the ritual healing isn't experienced, and there's unfinished business. There's unhealed issues people have. And so I have a couple of clients right now I'm working with who have had as children, so I'll tell one story, and this woman is happy to have me tell her story if it can be of help to other people. She's 53, and when she was 3 years old, her mother and sister died together in childbirth. And it was really shocking, really surprising, and really traumatic. And she was the only other child in the family. So it left her and her father and the circle of grandmothers and aunts and family members who stepped in to support. And the family was traumatized, and they responded as well as they were able to, but there wasn't really resources or skill in that community or in that family to respond in a way that really met what had happened. And so what happened was my client, there was a funeral. The baby wasn't named at the funeral, in fact wasn't named at all, and wasn't given a tombstone. Although she was buried with her mother, she wasn't marked on the tombstone, and my client didn't go to the funeral. And all those things were with the intention of reducing pain or making it as good as it could be made. But really what they did was leave a hole that 50 years later we went back and patched up. And so the image that was so clear to my client and I as we worked with this is that her baby sister had never been received by the living. She'd never been claimed as part of that family. And those are the rituals we do around childbirth, when there's a baby shower and just all the natural greetings and introducings and naming, and this is your sister and this is your aunt. Those experiences weave a person into the fabric of a family, and they really establish very palpable lines of energy in the energetic structure of a family. Well, this baby had never been woven in. And so 50 years later, my client didn't really know. Do I have a sister? Did I have a sister? Was I an only child in that first family? Like she didn't know how to hold all that, and it was a confusion in her life. Mm-hmm. And so we worked together probably for 2 or 3 months, just clarifying that, going back and sort of peeling back the layers to these old memories, and welcoming and receiving her sister. So one of the things she did was to name her. And she had remembered her dad years ago telling her the name that they had planned to pick for this baby. So she named her that, and for her middle name, she gave her mother's name. So then when we talked about her, we talked about her name. She named her Sherry. So suddenly Sherry started to become real. She started to be woven into the family, into this world, into the living. And my client started to talk. Her dad had married again when she was still quite young, and she had 2 stepbrothers. And everybody knew this had happened, but nobody really talked about it. She started to talk to her stepbrother about what it was about. She started to have some more conversations with her dad, who's 89, but still carrying this, and to just make her sister real. And then we worked some more, and it became clear that her sister was here, but now she needed to be sent there. And so we had a funeral. 50 years later, she invited some close friends to a ceremony at her house. She had a tombstone made, and she inscribed Sherry's name and her birth and death date, which are the same, on this tombstone. And it was a really profound ritual gesture to carve her name in stone. It was,
wow.
It was really surprisingly meaningful. When she picked that up, that was one of the big energy points of the whole process. Like, she's real. She's real because her name is carved in stone. So we had a funeral, and she asked her friends to come on her behalf to be the village that would support them. And she asked somebody to write a eulogy. She asked someone else who had 3 sisters to write a benediction on being a sister and what it means to be a sister and to be part of a sisterhood, because that was really where one of the places my client was really struggling. And we did it just like any other funeral would be, and we read the eulogies, we facilitated, I did all the process, and then we laid the stone in the backyard. And that, we consecrated some ground and we laid the stone there, and that was really the launch that said, okay, we're sending you now to the dead. And then later she took the stone back to the small town in eastern Canada where she was born, and with her dad, they laid the stone and had it inserted in the graveyard where her mother is buried. And for the first time in 50 years, she and her mother and her father and her sister were all together.
Wow.
And that family was made whole again. It was a really powerful, beautiful process, and it changed so many things in her life. Mm-hmm. It just shifted these deep patterns of grief and some shame, because her sister needed the funeral, but she needed the funeral too. She needed the funeral to have a social validation of her grief. Even as a young child, she'd have that energetic experience of her community gathering around her to say, what's happened is terrible, and it's okay to feel bad. But she didn't get that. And so all her life she's carried some shame about her grief. And there's probably more factors involved, but I think that having attended the funeral would have made a difference.
Yeah, and in that day and age, people believed that she would never remember it, therefore it would have no impact on her. But what we know is that those early childhood experiences are profound. And at 3, she was old enough to know that a baby was on the way, that a new baby was coming, that a baby brother or sister was coming to their family, and there had been preparations. And so I can just imagine the confusion and loss that she had carried her entire lifetime from that event.
Yeah, it was really deep. And they either they thought she wouldn't remember, that's very likely, or they would have thought maybe it would be too hard for her. Mm-hmm. You know, and we don't want to subject her to anything else. This will be for her benefit. Either way, you know, they're well-intentioned, but they're not particularly accurate. Yeah.
Yes. And we'll just let her forget this and it will never come up again, not knowing that she would indeed carry this painful burden all of her life.
Yes.
But what a beautiful resolution. That it really shows the power of that sort of ritual, and that it's never too late. So whatever has been left undone that from our past, it's still possible to hold those very meaningful healing rituals.
And ritual, it does exactly that. It can reach back into the past. When you open a ritual space, that sacred container, you step outside of time and space. You step into the way that we're all connected with everything. And those lines of energy, those threads are more visible or palpable. And so whether something happened yesterday or 50 years ago, it doesn't matter because it's all right there. At that funeral, her grief was real, and it was like it happened yesterday.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a beautiful story. Just such a wonderful illustration of this powerful tool of rituals, and how we all need to be mindful of it, and mindful allowing time for rituals and making sure that we put our energy into these important rituals too.
And put our energy into it, and there's also a way that we support each other in it. In that ritual space, the people who are the most deeply affected, who are grieving the most intently, who are closest to the situation, whatever it is, a death, a big diagnosis, a big surgery, whatever those big life-changing experiences are, those people in the middle, the person it's happening to, and the people right around, they need to be held. It's too much to ask someone in that circle to facilitate or even to know what needs to happen.
Mm-hmm.
It can be just overwhelming, and it blows your circuits to be in that space, and you just sort of need to let yourself be blasted open and let somebody else hold the container. And so you can do the healing work in the container, those people who are most impacted by it. But it helps a lot if someone who's got a little bit of distance can hold the space for it to happen.
That's a great reminder that something that we can do for our friends and our loved ones is to be mindful of their need for ritual space and be willing to be there for them, as you said, to hold that container.
Yes. Yeah, it makes a big difference. And then the people in the container, they're not also trying to manage the bigger picture. They just get to relax and release and do the healing work. They're not responsible for anybody else. And someone else is taking responsibility for them and their experience, or giving them the spaces they need in a way that's safe.
It's interesting when you mentioned, say, before a big surgery, and what popped into my mind is the routine that the operating room staff go through before a surgery is very much a ritual. Even the washing of hands and the gowning and gloving and everything. There are these rituals we engage in medicine, but probably would never really call it ritual or would never think of that as creating a sacred space. But as you talk about it, it made me realize that it definitely is. It's going through a process that opens up this sacred space to allow for the possibility of healing on the physical level through the surgery that is taking place. And while all those procedures are, there's a rational reason for them too, but it makes sense to me that we're doing so much more than just following, good clinical procedure.
Oh, I think that's so true. It lets our psyches know, lets our souls know that we're stepping into a different kind of space, and that this is a special kind of space, and something important and special is going to happen here. And it's the preparation that does exactly that. Let's shift. The image I have is often like the channel, dial on a radio, changing channels, and opening a ritual space or any kind of ritual practice that's repeated turns us to a different channel. So we're starting to operate on a little different channel than we do out in our everyday lives.
Well, tell us another story. I know you have some other stories, and I think the stories are so valuable because they're just perfect illustrations of the use of ritual.
I will tell a story. I'll just respond to one other thing you said quickly, which is the idea of surgeries. And I haven't done this kind of a ceremony or ritual for anybody, but I just feel so strongly that it would be helpful. That rituals before a big surgery, say someone has had a cancer diagnosis and they're going in for a mastectomy, right? That's a huge transition and a huge shift and has huge spiritual significance. And I have a vision of a beautiful kind of ceremony that could happen in a few days just before, say, a mastectomy, where a woman gathers with her family, her women friends, whoever feels right to her, to really say goodbye to her breast and to say goodbye to who she has been as a woman with two breasts and who she is going to become after this surgery. And that is a beautiful parallel to the medical care for physical body. This is the the ritual care of her soul. That I think there are so many places where some ritual work could help us navigate the big changes. And as I say, I haven't done that, but I just think it would be such a beautiful thing to be able to do.
Oh, I love the idea.
So now I'll tell you a story about one I just did.
Okay.
And that's a story about one I'd like to do. I just did probably in the last 5 or 6 weeks, a beautiful funeral ceremony for a man who lived rurally near Calgary. He was 63, and he was an organic farmer, raised grass-fed beef. And he and his wife and their 4 young adult children had really been committed all their lives to health, and all the kids had been born with midwives, and they were really connected to the land and to that spiritual tradition. And I met that family about a month before he died. His name was Richard. And again, he and his family are very happy to have this story shared. And went out to their farm to set the frame for the next process that they were all going through, and introduced them to 3 really important images that were the guiding images for the next work we would do together. And I worked with them till a few days after his death. We finished the final funeral facilitation. And those 3 images, the first was an Ojibwe understanding that I learned from one of my big teachers, a man named Stephen Jenkinson. And he describes this Ojibwe knowing of what happens to you when you die. And the Ojibwe are Great Lakes people. And their understanding of what happens is that when you die, you find yourself on the shore of a lake. And on the beach, there are footprints. And those footprints are the footprints of the people who've died before you. But they're not there anymore because they've crossed the lake. They've made the voyage to the village of the ancestors. But they need some help to do that. They need a canoe. And the village of the living, it's the responsibility of the living to help the dead get to where they need to go. This goes back to a funeral being a really pragmatic ritual. Mm-hmm. What the living do is build a canoe. And they build a canoe out of their love. And that canoe is what carries this person across to the village of the ancestors. And it's fueled by grief, which is why paddles are shaped like tears.
Wow.
So it makes us understand that our grief is important. It's energy that propels the one we love across. And the other thing that the living do is call the ancestors. We call them and say, he's coming. Get ready to meet him. Come to the shore. Be prepared. He's coming to you. He's going to need your welcome. And what the ancestors do is they reach out with their love, and they pull the canoe the second half of the way across the lake. So grief pushes it out, and love pulls it in the final stretch.
Wow.
It's a really beautiful image. Mm-hmm. And I would say it's one of the guiding images underneath almost all the work I do around end of life. So that's one image that I introduced them to that really gave them a language for what was happening and where Richard was going and how to, all of them, to be in relationship with that. Mm-hmm. And the second image is of a series of concentric circles. And the person who's dying is at the very center of that series of circles. They're the center point. And everybody else in their life is arranged around them based on how close they are. So it's a very easy thing for people to understand. You kind of know where you are in relation to someone. His wife was first, and then his kids and siblings, and went out and out and out and out to the very edge of the most sort of distantly connected person who came to his final funeral. All those people see themselves in relationship with him and are somewhere in those concentric circles. Mm-hmm. And so in those concentric circles, there's energy flowing 2 ways. There's energy flowing in to the middle, and it's support. So each person supports the circle inside there. so his wife supports him. His children, they're also close in. And the larger community and the family around that supports them. And it goes out and out. So support flows in. And the person in the middle, his job is just to die. That's his job. He's not supporting anybody. He's receiving. Support flows in, but what flows out is teaching. So the dying person and the family right around them who are close to him, how they do what they do is a beautiful gift to the rest of the community. Mm-hmm. And all they have to do is do it and be present to it. But what it does is address that issue I talked about. And I was so surprised and left so unprepared when my dad had his stroke. I'd never seen anyone deal with it. But if it was set up in a situation where the support flowed in and the teachings flowed out, I'd have had a better understanding. Mm-hmm. So that image was really important. And the third image is quite a simple one, is that birth and death are opposite sides of the same process. So just as someone is born into this world and their mother labors to bring them in, when we die, it's the other end of that journey. We're moving out the other end. And I think that's a big, important difference. Not that life and death are opposites. Life includes both birth and death. Mm-hmm. And so we really held an understanding that Richard was being born into another life, another experience that we don't understand or know, but we trust it's there. And that not only does he labor to go through that process, but the people around him struggle, and it's hard, like a birth can be. But that we support it. And so my work as a death midwife is to support that other end of the birth, which is death. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what I do is really help people by giving them a structure, a map. And when we had set up in a series of rituals, and when Richard died, he died at about 9 o'clock at night, and about 2, his family was all around him as he died, and they knew he was going to die at home. About 2 in the morning, they made the plans to start washing his body. They were going to do home death care and keep his body at home for the whole process. So they washed him, and they anointed him with essential oils and dressed him in his favorite clothes and laid him back in his bed in the house that he'd grown up in, and where his wife had slept with him the night before. And so 4 in the morning, he was all laid out in honor, and so his wife crawled back into bed with him. And then the cat came and jumped in between the two of them, and their youngest daughter curled up on the other side of her mom, and they all slept that way till dawn. So that beautiful ritual, which was really focused on the very center of those concentric circles, was the first step in helping the family grieve and helping Richard make the journey to the beach. Right? His soul was supported by this beautiful ritual space. And then the next day, they kept him at home for 3 days. The next day I came, and that evening I facilitated a family storytelling circle.
Oh, and I love that.
Yeah, he had a lot of kids, and he had a lot of siblings, and his wife had a lot of siblings. There were lots of family. So we had the next level of the concentric circle, which was about 25 people, his children and his siblings and their families. And we sat on their front porch, and he was in the bed just on the other side of the window from us, and we told stories, and I introduced it and kept the flow going, and each person, starting again in the middle of those concentric circles, talked about what they loved about him and what they would miss about him. It was really beautiful, and it was really sad. A lot of tears. But then as we moved out and out to the next layers of the circle, it started to get funny, because he was a funny guy, and there were funny stories. And so there was a lot of really raucous laughter and tears, and laughter and tears. And it helped move that energy and gave people a place to be heard and to express what they were feeling. It was a beautiful, beautiful evening. It went on for 2 or 3 hours. And that was the next layer of the concentric circles. The next day, we had the next layer, which was about 140 people. And Richard and his wife had lived on 4 sections. So the center of the cross in the middle of their 4 pieces, he had a big stone erected, huge, like the size of 2 deep freezes, really big stone, and with a plaque on it about the native people of the land and his parents who had homesteaded that land. And that's where they had weddings and poetry readings, and it was a real sacred place for their family. So we carried his body to the stone, to the big rock. They call it the rock. And his son and his brother built a canoe for him. And the canoe was
Oh, wow.
It was a platform. It was beautiful. We called it a prairie canoe because it was a platform of aspen logs. And on top of that were pine boughs. And he and his wife had raised buffalo. So on top of that was a buffalo hide. And a group of young men, his sons and their cousins, carried his body out, put it on the canoe, and then in beautiful ritual space, in silence except for a drum, we walked it out to the rock. His body went first, and then the line of people, 100 and some odd people behind, lined up in the order of the concentric circles, again, so that the kitchen was clear. And at the rock, we laid his body on some sawhorses in front of the rock and did a ceremony there to launch his canoe. So I told the story again, because there were more people who hadn't heard it. And each of the dozen people in the closest circles came up, and one by one, they tucked something in the canoe with him. It was hair from his beloved dog, or a poem, or some beautiful little gift. And they spoke about what they loved about him and what they were sending with him. And then, when they'd all spoken, then all the people in the audience, the first thing we did, was we called his ancestors. And we called the ancestors of everybody in that room. And that was a beautiful process, where people, it was done in silence. I rattled, but it was silent. No one spoke. And I looked out in the sea of faces, and everybody's eyes were closed, and their faces were all at full volume. Whatever it was they were feeling it deeply, as they called their beloved dead to meet Richard.
Wow.
It was gorgeous, gorgeous. Then his family tucked their little goodies in with him, and then everybody in the group, in the community assembled there, came up in one by one to a beautiful choral chant, a 4-part beautiful song about returning to Mother Earth that some of his nieces sang. Everybody came past and picked up a little bit of dried prairie sage that grew on that land and tucked it in with their prayers and blessings for his journey. They all walked past his body, and they said their goodbyes. People leaned down and kissed him, touched his face, whatever they needed to do to really say the goodbyes they needed to say. And we put everybody back in their seats again, and then the last thing I did was it's a Peruvian ritual called a death spiral, which is an energy medicine practice that when someone dies, it unhooks their spirit from their body. It involves the chakras and rattling, and we really unwound his spirit and launched it with lots of drumming and singing, and it was an incredible process. And I could see the difference, but I was really amazed in this situation how many other people in that group saw the difference in him. He'd been dead for 2 days, but he was gone after that. His face was blank. There had been something in his face, and then there wasn't. And everybody was very clear, like, wow, now it's time to cremate him, because he's not here anymore. So the next day, they drove him themselves to the crematorium and loaded him in on his canoe. The pine boughs, everything went in with him, and all the gifts that had been tucked in with him. And he was cremated, and they brought him home, brought home his ashes, and then the next day we had a ceremony in the community hall in the town with about, I think there were 450 people there. It was the biggest level of all those extended circles. He'd been a really important person in that community and had a lot of people who cared about him. And so we told that story again. I told the story again of the canoe and really helped people understand their role in this, that on the outside of the circle, they're playing a role. Their being there matters.
Yes.
And this one looked more like a regular kind of funeral. There was a slideshow, and people spoke and read poetry. And I gave a eulogy. And it was a lot of what I did talk about in the eulogy was the last few days of his life and his death. So people really understood where he was and how he'd been helped to get there. Mm-hmm. And the beautiful thing about that was that his family and the people in the close circles by that point, had so much ritual support that they weren't bringing their raw grief to this funeral. Mm-hmm. They'd had that met. At the funeral, this was serving the larger community so they could engage, and was also allowing that bigger community to support the family. All the family had to do was really receive the love. They weren't trying to process other emotions because we'd done that so much in the 3 days before. So it was a beautiful, beautiful extended funeral process. And the comments I got so much from all the different family members in different ways were essentially that they were at peace. Mm-hmm. They were sad, there was grief, but they were at peace. And they've all been able to move forward with much more ease than other people I've seen. They really, they integrated it. So that's a long story, but it's a big picture of what happens, and I think it really offers us a model of what a new Western version of a really effective funeral ritual might be.
Mm-hmm. It's so beautiful, and I mean, I guess I'm relating to it personally, but I keep, when you were talking about the concentric circles, I was thinking about how healthcare workers who've been involved with patients during their illness also have a ring in the concentric circle, and how often, particularly in the hospital, doctors and nurses miss out on those rituals, don't often attend memorial services or funerals for patients that die in the hospital because they don't feel close enough to the family or the patient to actually take part in that, but they're missing out on an opportunity to heal this ongoing perpetual load of grief that they carry from the work that they do every day.
That is so true. I don't think I've thought about it quite that way before. I think you're really right there. Mm-hmm. And it makes me want to wonder how can that shift?
How can we help with that? Because one of the things that I've identified as I've been looking at, why physicians are reluctant to engage in end-of-life care and talk to their patients about it, and it seems clear that the cumulative grief that doctors are carrying is part of the problem. It's their own pain that they can't face and don't want to deal with and don't want to be confronted with that makes them shy away from the entire subject and not want to go near it. So your story and thinking of, oh my goodness, how much simple rituals could actually change that and change things, especially if we use them in hospital settings.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know that locally at our hospital, which is a teaching hospital, they have a ritual once a year for the cadavers that the students have worked on. And that's one way that they're addressing that. It's not exactly the same, but it's a little bit, a glimmer of the same connection.
It's a beginning.
And in long-term care centers, I know where my dad is, they have once every 2 or 3 months, they have a ceremony on behalf of all the people who've died in that time. But there's certainly, I don't know if that happens in hospitals for people who are so busy dealing so directly. And hospitals too.
Yeah, I know in our hospice we had an annual memorial service just for staff, actually, for staff to come and kind of process their grief. And then I made it a habit to attend a lot of the funerals of our patients that I felt close to, because for me that was very healing to be just to be able to be there and be amongst the mourners, and as you said, to just observe and to receive the teaching from those closest to the deceased, and to be a witness to it and to hold the container. That was really powerful for me.
And that's another reason why having funerals is so important, because all the people who are served by being able to attend.
Yes, and it's clear that if anything we need much more ritual, because our society has kind of I guess we create our own rituals of sorts at times, but it seems to me that formal rituals we're kind of tossing aside as if, who needs a marriage ceremony? Just go get a wedding, just go get a license with the justice of the peace. We don't need a ritual, we don't need a ceremony. But you make so much sense that we desperately need those moments. We need those times. We need those times apart, those times outside of time and space where we acknowledge this shifting that's taking place.
Yeah. For our souls. It's really about the soul as far as I can see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, definitely.
And about those patterns of energy. Because quantum physics tells us, and indigenous teachings tell us, that energy is what's underneath everything. And every phenomena in the world has an energetic pattern at its roots. The coffee table, your car, the traffic as it flows through a city, the dynamics of a family, the dynamics of a person in their life, and the experiences they've had and how they carry those. Those are all patterns of energy. Mm-hmm. And we can push all we want on physical things to try and shift things, but it's much more effective to go underneath the physical and to change the patterns of energy. When we bring those back into balance, the physical just follows. And rituals really do that. They just restore the balance in ways that are just so profound.
That brings me to one of the questions that we had talked about is do you have some tips or some practical suggestions for listeners about creating rituals? Because some of us haven't experienced enough rituals in our lives to maybe feel comfortable with that process of creating rituals. And do you have any suggestions about that?
I think there are lots of things people could do, and they could be very simple and very meaningful. I studied a lot with a teacher from West Africa named Malidoma Some, and he talks about this, and I really believe it's true, that the ability to make ritual is built into our DNA. We know how to do it. And I think a lot of developing rituals is just trusting our intuition and doing whatever we need to do to mark that something is sacred. And it can be a tiny little ritual, like every morning going out the backyard and pouring a little water on the ground and giving gratitude for your life and blessings on the healing and the life and the process that someone you love is going through. And healing may be different than curing. They may be dying, but they can still find healing in that process. It's about finding a gesture that shifts the energy. It might be an altar where you set up a place and you put a few things that are important to you about your ancestors, say, or the person you know who's dying, or your own death, and going to that altar every day, lighting a candle and just saying a prayer in whatever way is meaningful to you for whatever healing or well-being you are asking for. Intention is a really big part of ritual, and some rituals happen once, and that's perfect, but for many rituals, repetition, like the washing of the hands outside the surgical suite, repetition starts to build those tracks of energy. So phoning your mother every day after dinner, that can be a ritual. And some things we do all the time are rituals, but we don't necessarily imbue them with that meaning. If you pause just for 30 seconds before you phone your mom in the evening and say, I'm phoning her for a reason, and it's because I love her and I want to connect with her and I want to support her and I want to hear from her and really touch into the soul process of what's happening, then that can make just a simple phone call closer to that sacred ritual space. The other thing that's a good sort of guiding principle for ritual is to think about it as poetry. And it's like visual poetry. I don't know how to describe it better than that, but in the story about Richard and his sons and nephews carrying this beautiful prairie canoe, it was poetic. The pine boughs, the buffalo hide, walking out to the rock. It's choosing things that are beautiful and that awaken our soul's love of poetry. And it's not written poetry, but it's a physical kind of poetry. So really, for people who are curious about how to integrate ritual in their lives around end of life and death work, for practitioners, it might be pausing at the door just before you walk into someone's room. Just clarify and center yourself and connect with your own self as a healthcare practitioner, the healing power. And give a little prayer that you bring the best of who that is into the room. That's a powerful ritual that will benefit your patients. And maybe that's one way. Another way is to prepare yourself, because grief can be a big burden. And if people take it on and take it on and take it on, it's hard to get out from underneath it. But if you can, before people walk into a room, just set a little boundary that I'm going to connect, but I'm not going to carry away any of this pain. I'm not going to take any. There's lots of grief and pain floating around in those rooms. I'm not going to let them affix to us, which is kind of a physical description of what happens energetically, but to stay clear, stay in your own experiences. Go in, do the work, and then leave, and as you cross the threshold going out again, just imagine a golden shower. Leave behind everything that's not yours. Those could be powerful rituals for keeping your own energy body clear and clean.
I like that idea. And so the ritual, our ability to utilize ritual really comes from within us. It's not, we don't have to study it, we don't have to learn about it. We simply have to allow it. It sounds as if the need for ritual is kind of innate in us, and if we just relax into it and allow it, we will find ourselves creating our own perfect rituals.
That's absolutely true. And if we connect to our deeper intention as the guiding force, then the ritual coalesces around that intention. So we set an intention of healing or energetic clarity or processing grief or heartfelt communication, right? In a storytelling circle. That might be the intention, and a safe space for heartfelt communication. And once we set an intention, then our souls respond with what the appropriate ritual would be. And allowing is just the word, to just not judge, not think, it should be different, it should be more complex, it should be anything. Simple, simple, simple is beautiful.
Wow. Well, you've given me so much to think about, and it's your work is so inspiring, Sarah. And I want to just remind our listeners, I've been so entranced here that I haven't even said your name again, that I'm talking to Sarah Kerr. And I want listeners to know about your website, which is soulpassages.ca. Is that correct?
Yes.
soulpassages.ca. And then just tell us a little bit more about who you work with and how you might work with people.
Most of the work I do with people is local, just because there are physical rituals that I host and facilitate for them. But certainly from a distance, what seems to work well is just having someone to help offer a map and to help give some energetic framing to what's happening. I talked to a client the other day, and her father has had a stroke and he's stopped eating. He's kind of pulling back. It's clear that he's at the end. And she said he's here and then he's not here, and it was really confusing and distressing for her. And so a lot of what I helped do was give the map and let her know that, well, he's here when he's here, but when he's not here, he's actually making journeys there. And he's here a little bit, there a little bit, the other side of the veil, back and forth and back and forth. And then at some point, he'll go there and he won't come back. And so helping people understand the spiritual map of what's happening at a death is something that can be really helpful at a distance. And also helping people design their own rituals that may be a little more than just come to them automatically, because it's like any art form. The more you practice it, the more you develop the skills. So I have a big repertoire, and so I can help people design their own rituals around whatever issue it is they're dealing with. It might be an old death from the past. It might be, we talked about, some kind of big diagnosis or surgery, or around the processes of a death that's happening right now. I also am not at that stage yet, but am planning to offer some courses, both online and face-to-face courses, around really the technology of ritual to help people who are in all sorts of supporting roles around end-of-life work to understand the ritual and the energy dynamics that are happening so they can deepen their work. And people can find out about that. I have a newsletter that comes out once a month that has articles and links to resources and updates about what I'm offering. If they're interested, they can sign up there to hear about classes as those develop.
Well, that's wonderful. And as you mentioned, though we are all capable of creating ritual for ourselves, sometimes also when we're stressed and traumatized, it's difficult for us to be in that creative space. So how wonderful to have your support and your creativity to inspire people in their time of need, to help them come up with the perfect ritual for the time they're going through.
Yeah, it's a beautiful privilege to be able to be with people in that space. I think the reason I love my work so much is because I love being with people when they're real, when we're all real. And in times of big trauma or big transitions and shifts, some of the outer masks fall away, and what's really true and really real is present. And it might be painful, and it might be sad, and it might be messy, but it's true. And so being able to be with people in that space is such a gift and a privilege.
So true, and that's a perfect note to end on, because I think that sums up this end-of-life work in general, and how those of us who do work in various aspects of the end of life feel so privileged and benefit so much, as you said, from being with people at this time when they are so real and so genuine. So, Sarah Kerr, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been a wonderful conversation. We could just go on for a few more hours, I'm sure. and I really want to thank you for sharing your stories.
Well, thank you for having me. And Karen, thank you for the work you're doing. I've been a keen follower of the End of Life University, and I've listened to many, many of your interviews. And I just am so impressed at your clarity and your really open-heartedness, and how you're bringing such important information to people who may not live in places where that information is so available. I can't thank you enough for the work you're doing and for the opportunity to be part of it. It's really beautiful.
Well, thank you so much. And I just want to say doing these interviews is totally my pleasure, and has inspired me in so many ways. So I'm deeply grateful to you, Sarah, for being here, and for all of our other guests. And as well, I'm grateful for all the listeners who take time out of their day to sit with us and join in and listen and bring your energy into the conversation as well. And End of Life University wouldn't exist without all of you out there offering your support and your encouragement. So thank you so much to everyone who tuned in today. And remember, there's a new interview posted approximately every 2 weeks. So be sure and tune in the next time and tune into our conversation. And until then, take care. Goodbye.